In the early 7th century, a movement emerged from the deserts of Arabia that would transform the political and religious landscape of the world. At the center of that movement stood a man named Muhammad. Born in the city of Mecca around the year 570 CE, Muhammad would become the founder of Islam and the leader of a community that, within a single generation, united much of the Arabian Peninsula. The revelations attributed to Muhammad form the text known as the Qur'an, regarded by Muslims as the literal word of God. Yet, Muhammad's role was not limited to that of a religious teacher. Historical sources describe him as a political leader, lawgiver, diplomat, and military commander who presided over the formation of a new social and political order in Arabia. The historian W. Montgomery Watt wrote, Muhammad's achievement was not merely the founding of a religion, but the creation of a community and state. Muhammad at Medina understanding Muhammad's life therefore requires examining both religious tradition and historical evidence. The earliest sources for his life include the Qur'an itself, later collections of sayings known as hadith, and early biographies written by Muslim historians such as Ibn Ishaq. Modern historians also analyze these sources alongside archaeological evidence and the broader historical context of late antiquity. Together, they reveal a story that is both religious and political, the rise of a movement that reshaped Arabia and eventually influenced the course of world history. To understand the rise of Muhammad, it is necessary to understand the world into which he was born. 6th century Arabia was not a unified political entity. Instead, the peninsula consisted of a complex network of tribes whose identities were based on kinship, clan loyalty, and alliances. Political authority was decentralized. Tribal leaders governed their own communities, and conflicts between tribes were common. Raiding expeditions, known as ghaz, were a regular feature of Arabian life and served both economic and social functions. The historian Robert Hoyland writes, Arabian society in the 6th century was structured around tribes whose relationships were defined by alliance, rivalry, and competition for resources. In God's path at the same time, Arabia was not isolated from the wider world. To the north lay two great empires, the Byzantine Empire and the Sassanid Persian Empire. For centuries, these powers had competed for influence across the Near East. Trade routes connecting these empires passed through the Arabian Peninsula, bringing merchants, goods, and ideas. Cities such as Mecca prospered from this trade. Religion in Arabia before Islam was diverse. Many tribes practiced forms of polytheism, worshipping multiple gods associated with natural forces or tribal identities. These deities were often represented by idols housed in sanctuaries. The most famous sanctuary was the Kaaba in Mecca. Pilgrims from across Arabia visited the site to perform rituals and honor the various gods represented there. The Qur'an later refers to this environment of idol worship in several passages. One verse states, "They have taken besides God gods that cannot create anything but are themselves created." Quran 16:20. However, polytheism was not the only religious tradition present in Arabia. Jewish communities had existed in parts of the peninsula for centuries, particularly in the oasis towns of the north and west. Christian influence was also present, especially in regions connected to the Byzantine Empire. The historian Fred Donner notes, Arabia was religiously pluralistic, with Jewish, Christian, and indigenous traditions interacting with one another. These influences would play a significant role in shaping the religious message that emerged in the early 7th century. Muhammad was born around 570 CE in the city of Mecca. He belonged to the Quraysh tribe, one of the most powerful tribes in the region. The Quraysh controlled much of the city's commerce and served as custodians of the Kaaba. Muhammad's early life, according to Islamic tradition, was marked by hardship. His father died before he was born, and his mother died when he was 6. He was raised first by his grandfather and later by his uncle Abu Talib, who was a respected member of the Quraysh clan. Growing up within this tribal system would have shaped Muhammad's understanding of leadership, loyalty, and conflict. As a young man, Muhammad reportedly worked as a merchant, traveling with trade caravans across Arabia. These journeys may have brought him into contact with communities influenced by Judaism and Christianity, exposing him to monotheistic ideas that differed from the polytheistic traditions of Mecca, according to early Islamic sources. Muhammad gained a reputation for honesty and reliability. Later, Muslim tradition refers to him as Al-Amin, meaning the trustworthy. It was during this period that Muhammad met Khadija, a wealthy widow who employed him as a trader. Impressed by his character, she later proposed marriage. Their union would last 25 years and provide Muhammad with financial stability and social status. Around 610 CE, Muhammad began experiencing what he described as revelations from God, according to Islamic tradition. The first revelation occurred while he was meditating in a cave near Mecca. These revelations would continue over the next 22 years. They formed the basis of the Qur'an. The Qur'an presents Muhammad as a messenger delivering divine guidance to humanity. One passage states, "Recite in the name of your Lord who created," Qur. And 96, "To one another." Verse describes the nature of revelation. This is the book about which there is no doubt. A guidance for those conscious of God. Quran 2:2. Muhammad's message emphasized monotheism and warned of divine judgment. He called on people to abandon idol worship and submit to the will Allah. Muhammad's message challenged the existing religious system of Mecca. Rejecting the traditional gods threatened the authority of the Quraysh elite, whose prestige and income were connected to the pilgrimage cult centered on the Kaaba. As a result, opposition to Muhammad grew. The Quran records several passages responding to critics who rejected his message. For example, they say, "Why was this Qur and not revealed to a great man of the two cities?" Qur and 43-31, another verse addresses accusations that Muhammad had invented the revelations. Or do they say, he has fabricated it? Say, then bring 10 chapters like it. Qur'an 11:13. These passages illustrate the growing conflict between Muhammad and the leadership of Mecca, despite opposition. Muhammad gradually attracted a group of followers. Among the earliest were members of his own family and close associates. As the movement grew, tensions with the Quraysh intensified. Some early Muslims reportedly faced persecution, and a small group migrated to Abyssinia, where a Christian ruler offered them protection. The situation in Mecca eventually became untenable. By the early 620s, the conflict between Muhammad's followers and the leadership of Mecca had reached a critical point. Muhammad's message had attracted a small but committed group of followers. Yet the movement remained politically weak within the city. The Quraysh elite viewed his teachings not only as a religious challenge, but also as a threat to the social order that sustained their authority. As tensions grew, Muhammad sought support beyond Mecca. Delegations from the oasis town of Yathrib, located approximately 320 kilometers north of Mecca, had already begun meeting with him. Yathrib was a divided city, home to several Arab tribes, as well as established Jewish communities. These groups had experienced long-standing conflicts and were searching for a figure who might serve as a mediator. According to early Islamic sources, representatives from Yathrib pledged support to Muhammad and invited him to settle in their city. In 622 CE, Muhammad and his followers left Mecca and traveled to Yathrib. This event became known as the Hijra, or migration. It marks the beginning of the Islamic calendar. The city of Yathrib would later become known as Medina, meaning the city of the Prophet. The migration represented a turning point in the development of the Islamic movement. In Mecca, Muhammad had been primarily a preacher and religious teacher. In Medina, he would become the leader of a community with political authority. The historian W. Montgomery Watt describes this transformation. The Hijra marks the point at which Muhammad ceased to be merely a preacher and became the head of a community exercising political power. In Medina, Muhammad began to organize his followers into a structured society. This included establishing new forms of social solidarity that went beyond traditional tribal loyalty. One of the earliest political documents attributed to Muhammad is often referred to as the Constitution of Medina. This document outlined agreements between the Muslim community and other groups living in the city, including Jewish tribes. It defined mutual obligations related to defense, justice, and social cooperation. The historian Fred Donner notes that this arrangement represented a significant shift in Arabian political culture. Muhammad's community in Medina created a new form of identity that transcended traditional tribal divisions. Members of the new community were bound together not only by kinship but by shared commitment to the emerging religious movement. This development marked the beginning of what historians often describe as the first Islamic polity. Despite the new stability in Medina, relations with Mecca remained hostile. Muhammad's followers had left behind property and wealth when they migrated. The Meccan leadership continued to view the movement as a threat. In response, the Muslim community began intercepting trade caravans belonging to the Quraysh. Such actions were consistent with the tradition of raiding expeditions, which were common in Arabian society. However, these raids also carried political significance. They represented an attempt to weaken Meccan economic power and assert the independence of the Medinan community. The Qur'an addresses this new phase of conflict in several passages. One verse states, permission to fight is given to those who have been wronged. Qur'an 22:39, another passage declares, "Fight in the way of God those who fight you, but do not transgress." Qur'an 2-190. These verses are often cited by scholars as reflecting the circumstances faced by the early Muslim community during its struggle for survival. Of course, another view could be taken, and that is that, when you encounter people who do not submit, fight them as they have been introduced to Islam and have failed to submit. Thus, they are wronging Islam by their rejection or his case refusal to submit to the rule of Muhammad. The first major military confrontation occurred in 620 for CE at a location known as Badr. Muhammad and his followers had set out to intercept a Quraysh caravan. However, a Meccan army marched to defend the caravan, leading to an unexpected battle. Despite being outnumbered, the Muslim forces achieved a decisive victory. The battle had profound psychological and political effects. The victory at Badr wasn't just a military win. It was a huge morale boost for Muhammad's followers in Medina. It proved they could stand up to a much larger, better-equipped enemy. The Qur'an itself speaks of this moment, saying, "God already gave you victory at Badr when you were weak." This divine validation solidified Muhammad's position as a leader. The battle also resulted in the capture of prisoners from Mecca. Sources tell us they were treated in different ways, with some being ransomed back to their wealthy families. But for the Quraysh in Mecca, Badr was a stinging defeat, and they were determined to get revenge. The very next year, in 625 CE, a massive Meccan army marched on Medina. The two forces clashed near a mountain called Uhud. At first, it looked like another victory for the Muslims. But a critical error, a breakdown in discipline on the battlefield, allowed the Meccan cavalry to swing around and launch a devastating counterattack. The battle ended without a clear winner, but the Muslims suffered heavy losses. This setback was framed in the Qur'an not as a failure, but as a test of faith. One passage explains, "What befell you on the day the two armies met was by permission of God." The Battle of Uhud made one thing clear: this conflict was far from over. 2 years later, in 627 CE, the Quraysh weren't taking any chances. They assembled a massive coalition of tribes and marched on Medina once again. This time, Muhammad's community adopted a brilliant defensive strategy. Following a suggestion from a Persian companion, they dug a huge trench around the vulnerable parts of the city, making a direct cavalry charge impossible. The tactic worked perfectly. The siege, which became known as the Battle of the Trench, dragged on for weeks. The coalition army was frustrated, and as harsh weather set in, their resolve crumbled, and they eventually withdrew. The Qur'an captures the tension of the siege, describing a moment when eyes grew wild and hearts reached the throats. The failure of this grand coalition was a major turning point. The momentum had now decisively shifted in favor of Muhammad and his followers. However, the Battle of the Trench also brought internal tensions in Medina to a boiling point. During the siege, some groups within the city were accused of conspiring with the enemy. One of these was the Banu Qurayza, a Jewish tribe that had an agreement with Muhammad. According to early Islamic historical accounts, they were accused of breaking this pact during the city's most vulnerable moment. After the coalition army retreated, the Muslim forces turned their attention to the Banu Qurayza's fortress. Following a siege, the tribe surrendered. The events that followed are some of the most debated in early Islamic history. The traditional accounts describe the execution of the men and the enslavement of women and children. The precise historical details, the political context, and the interpretation of these events remain subjects of intense discussion among historians to this day. What is clear is that by the late 620s, Muhammad's authority in Medina was undeniable. A string of military successes and strategic alliances with various tribes had dramatically strengthened the Muslim community's position. This consolidation of power is reflected in the Qur'an, which begins to address issues of governance, law, and social order more directly. Verses like "Obey God" and "Obey the Messenger" underscored a new political and religious hierarchy. Others, such as "The believers are but brothers," work to forge a strong, unified identity for this rapidly growing community. The balance of power in Western Arabia was changing. The early years of mixed outcomes in battle were giving way to a period of steady growth for the community in Medina. Muhammad's influence was no longer confined to the city walls. It was expanding across the peninsula, setting the stage for the next chapter, one that would be defined as much by diplomacy as by war. In the year 628 CE, a pivotal moment arrived, not on a battlefield, but on the road to Mecca. Muhammad, along with a large group of his followers, set out from Medina unarmed, intending to perform the Lesser Pilgrimage, a sacred and ancient Arabian tradition. It was a bold and peaceful gesture. However, when they reached the outskirts of Mecca, the Quraysh leadership blocked their path, refusing to let them enter the holy city. Tensions were high, but instead of fighting, the two sides entered into negotiations. At a place called Hudaybiyah, they forged an agreement. The Treaty of Hudaybiyah established a 10-year truce. The terms were specific. The Muslims would turn back this year, but would be allowed to return for the pilgrimage the following year. Crucially, the treaty also stipulated that any tribe in Arabia was now free to ally with either Mecca or Medina. At first, some of Muhammad's followers felt the treaty was a humiliation, a concession to their enemies. But history has shown it to be a masterful strategic move. The truce created a period of peace, which allowed the Muslim community to grow its influence through preaching, diplomacy, and new alliances without the constant threat of war. The Qur'an itself frames the treaty not as a setback, but as a clear conquest. With this truce secured, Muhammad's influence expanded rapidly. He focused on strengthening alliances with tribes all across the Arabian Peninsula. Many were drawn to the stability and growing power of Medina. Islamic tradition also records that during this period, Muhammad sent emissaries with letters to the rulers of the great powers of the day, including the leaders of the Byzantine and Persian empires. Whether these letters produced significant diplomatic results is debated by historians. However, they reflect the increasing confidence of the Medinan leadership. The Qur'an contains passages that address broader audiences beyond Arabia. For example, say, "O people of the book, come to a word that is common between us and you, that we worship none but God, Qur'an A. The phrase people of the book refers to communities possessing earlier scriptures, particularly Jews and Christians. Of course, when he states none but God, he meant Allah, highlighting he expected Jews and Christians to convert to Islam. Such passages suggest that Muhammad's message was framed not only as a new religious movement, but also as part of a wider monotheistic tradition. The truce established at Hudaybiyah lasted approximately 2 years. During that period, alliances shifted across Arabia. Eventually, a conflict between tribes aligned with the Muslims and those allied with the Quraysh brought the treaty to an end. Muhammad responded by assembling a large force and marching toward Mecca in 630 CE. The advance of the Muslim army placed the Quraysh in a difficult position. Faced with overwhelming numbers and limited options for resistance, the city largely surrendered without major fighting. Muhammad entered Mecca and took control of the city that had once been the center of opposition to his message. One of the most symbolic acts associated with the conquest was the removal of idols from the Kaaba, which was rededicated as a sanctuary devoted to the worship of one God. The Qur'an reflects this theme in a verse proclaiming, "Truth has come, and falsehood has vanished." Qur'an 17-81. The conquest of Mecca represented a decisive shift in the political and religious landscape of Arabia. The city that had once rejected Muhammad's message now became the spiritual center of the Islamic movement. Around this period, Islamic tradition also records a remarkable event known as the Night Journey. According to these traditions, Muhammad was taken from Mecca to Jerusalem and then ascended through the heavens. The Qur'an alludes to this journey in the opening verse of chapter 17. Glory be to him who took his servant by night from the sacred mosque to the farthest mosque. Qur'an 17-1 later, Islamic literature elaborates on this event, describing Muhammad traveling on a creature known as Buraq during the ascension. He is said to have encountered earlier prophets and witnessed aspects of the heavenly realm. The story holds deep symbolic meaning within Islamic tradition. However, historians generally view it through the lens of religious belief rather than verifiable historical event. Following the conquest of Mecca, the political authority of Muhammad expanded rapidly. Many tribes across Arabia entered alliances with the Muslim community. Some adopted Islam as part of those alliances, while others maintained political agreements with the Medinan leadership. The Qur'an contains passages reflecting this period of consolidation. One verse states, "When the help of God and victory comes." And you see the people entering the religion of God in multitudes. Qur'an 1:1012. By the early 630s, much of Western Arabia had recognized Muhammad's authority. The transformation of the Islamic movement from a small group of followers in Mecca to a dominant political force across the region had taken place within little more than 2 decades. In addition to political leadership and military command, the life of Muhammad also involved a series of marriages that played roles in the social and political structure of the emerging Muslim community. Marriage in 7th century Arabia often served diplomatic or clan-building functions. Alliances between tribes were frequently reinforced through family relationships. Muhammad's first marriage was to Khadija, a wealthy merchant widow in Mecca who was significantly older than he was. Their marriage lasted approximately 25 years and, according to Islamic tradition, remained monogamous during her lifetime. After Khadija's death, Muhammad entered a series of marriages. One of the most frequently discussed is his marriage to Aisha, the daughter of Abu Bakr, one of Muhammad's closest companions and a future political leader of the Muslim community. Early Islamic sources, including hadith collections such as those compiled by Al-Bukhari, state that Aisha was young at the time of the marriage. These traditions record that she was betrothed at 6 and that the marriage was consummated several years later. Historians continue to debate the historical context and interpretation of these reports, though they remain part of the traditional narrative preserved in Islamic literature. Muhammad's other marriages included widows of fallen allies, women connected to influential tribes, and individuals whose relationships reinforced the political network surrounding the Medinan community. The historian W. Montgomery Watt observed, many of Muhammad's marriages appear to have had political or social significance within the structure of Arabian tribal society. Muhammad at Medina, as Muhammad's authority expanded in Medina. The revelations preserved in the Qur'an increasingly addressed matters of governance, social conduct, and law. Earlier, Meccan revelations had focused primarily on themes of monotheism, divine judgment, and moral responsibility. Later revelations, however, dealt with issues such as marriage, inheritance, warfare, and social organization. For example, O you who believe, obey God and obey the Messenger and those in authority among you. Quran 4:59. Another passage addresses the structure of family life. Men are the maintainers of women because God has given some of them advantage over others. Quran 4:30. For the Quran also contains passages regulating warfare and relations with opponents. One verse declares, "Fight those who do not believe in God or the last day, and who do not consider unlawful what God and His Messenger have made unlawful." Quran 9:29. Other passages emphasize loyalty to the community and solidarity among believers. The believers are but brothers. Quran 49:10. These verses became the foundation for later Islamic legal traditions. Over time, scholars developed extensive systems of jurisprudence known as fiqh, interpreting the Quran and prophetic traditions to guide legal and social life. Following the conquest of Mecca in 630 CE, the political landscape of Arabia changed rapidly. Many tribes that had previously remained neutral or opposed to Muhammad began to recognize the authority of the Medinan community. Some alliances were based on religious conversion, while others were pragmatic political arrangements within the shifting power structure of the peninsula. Campaigns during this period included confrontations such as the Battle of Hunain, in which Muhammad's forces faced a coalition of tribes resisting the growing influence of the Muslim state. Despite early setbacks during the battle, Muhammad's forces ultimately prevailed. The Qur'an refers to the event, "God has already given you victory in many battles. And on the day of Hunain, when your numbers impressed you." Quran 9:25. These campaigns further consolidated Muhammad's authority across the region. by the early 630s. Much of Western and Central Arabia had entered into alliances with the Muslim leadership centered in Medina. The historian Fred Donner describes this development as the formation of a broad movement that included both religious and political elements. As the leader of the expanding community, Muhammad exercised multiple roles simultaneously. He served as a religious guide, political administrator, and military commander. Disputes within the community were often brought before him for judgment. The Qur'an reflects this authority, but know by your Lord. They will not truly believe until they make you judge concerning that over which they dispute. Qur'an 4-65 administrative practices within the growing Islamic polity included the collection of charity taxes, known as zakat, and the management of alliances with tribes across the peninsula. These systems laid the groundwork for later administrative structures under the early caliphates. In 630 CE, Muhammad undertook what became known as the farewell pilgrimage to Mecca. During this pilgrimage, he delivered a sermon addressing themes of social justice, unity, and the responsibilities of the Muslim community. Traditions recording the sermon emphasized several key themes. Among them were the equality of believers, the importance of treating others justly, and the continuation of the religious practices established during Muhammad's lifetime. The pilgrimage also reinforced the central importance of Mecca as the spiritual focal point of the Islamic faith. Shortly after returning to Medina from the pilgrimage, Muhammad fell ill. He died in 630 CE. Approximately 10 years after the Hijrah from Mecca, his death raised immediate questions about leadership within the rapidly expanding Muslim community. Muhammad had not established a clear succession structure that all factions accepted. As a result, leaders among his followers gathered to determine who would assume political authority. Eventually, Abu Bakr, a close companion of Muhammad and father of Aisha, was chosen as the first caliph, meaning successor or deputy. Following Muhammad's death, the newly formed Muslim polity entered a period of rapid expansion. The first challenge came from within Arabia itself. Several tribes that had previously allied with Muhammad attempted to break away from the Medinan leadership. These conflicts became known as the Ridda Wars, or Wars of Apostasy. Under the leadership of Abu Bakr, the Muslim forces defeated these rebellions and re-established control across the peninsula. After seizing Arabia, Muslim armies began expanding beyond its borders. Within a few decades, territories previously controlled by the Byzantine and Persian empires fell under Islamic rule. These conquests dramatically altered the political map of the Near East. Historians emphasize that these events occurred within the broader context of late antiquity, when both empires had been weakened by decades of warfare. Modern historians approach the life of Muhammad from a variety of perspectives. Some focus on the religious dimension of his message. Others emphasize the political transformation that occurred during his leadership. The historian Fred Donner writes, "The movement associated with Muhammad quickly became both a religious community and a political power." Similarly, Patricia Crone and other scholars have examined the early Islamic sources critically, comparing them with evidence from neighboring regions and contemporary records. These studies highlight the complexity of reconstructing events from sources written decades after the events they describe. The life of Muhammad remains one of the most influential in world history. Within a relatively short period, the movement he led transformed from a small group of followers in Mecca into a political and religious force that reshaped Arabia. The text associated with that movement, the Qur'an, became the foundational scripture of Islam and continues to influence the lives of billions of people. Understanding the historical context of Muhammad's life requires examining the political, social, and religious conditions of 7th century Arabia. It also requires careful analysis of the historical sources that preserve accounts of these events. For historians, the story of Muhammad and the rise of Islam remains a subject of ongoing research and debate. Yet there is little doubt that the developments of the 7th century created a new civilization whose influence would extend across continents and centuries.